Welcome again to our study of Douglas Duckworth's overview of Mipham Rinpoche's life, but of course primarily his teachings. And I would say specifically actually the teachings that concern us, as you could say, heirs to the teaching or the practice lineage of Mipham Rinpoche, Jamgön Khyentse Wangpo, and these masters that essentially constitute what we call the remade tradition, and sometimes also referred to as the Kien-Kong Chokson, and then also we can say in terms of the Sakya, Kaji, and Nyingma traditions, but very much sort of presenting a view that enables us to approach themes that are absolutely essential and integral to the practices that we come across right from the start of the Vajrayana path with the preliminary Mundu practices, and particularly then in the main practice itself, Vajrayana practice itself. But also it's important to understand how the whole Mahayana really serves as a foundation for what we call then the Vajrayana. So these are really, you could say, very helpful overviews. And of course, we can sometimes classify this as philosophy, but we are talking about experience. And so even though we are talking about phenomena that's not exactly tangible in the ordinary sense, we are talking about principles that rule our life, rule our existence, essentially what carries us into conditions of confusion and conditions of clarity. You could say the tendency towards samsara and the tendency towards nirvana. And that's where it's very helpful once we understand the dynamics basic to these conditions that we can then engage proactively in what we call the path and be proactive in terms of eliminating confusion and unveiling the condition of awakening. So that said, then invoking Jamgön Mipham Rinpoche, through the blessing of awareness emptiness, Manjushri Kumara, you open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So we're in part 2 overview of Mipham, Jamgön Mipham's Buddhist work. And we're going to look at something that's basic to, again, what we so often encounter really is the aspects of our experience, which are very well documented in the mind-only school. And of course, the middle way, the Madhyamika, the insight into the absolute nature of reality. And what we will see here is actually that we see how they actually work together. So Professor Duckworth, he says, a distinctive feature of Mipham's work is his keen ability to show the compatibility of different systems of thought in diverse representations of truth. So this is then and this very much is, you could say, this very much signifies all of the Buddhist teaching, but particularly coming from then, as we looked at last time, the perspective of the great perfection, in which all the various teachings, they essentially are seen to work in, which essentially are seen as compatible. So anyway, in the first section then, we talk about this thing that we call ascending scale of analysis. And some of you might have been following the study on Mondays, which are about the various ascending understandings, the progressive stages of understanding emptiness, and how this is applied in meditation. And that's where we would say, and we're going to be looking at something very interesting, which is, you could say, the depth of analysis that enable us increasingly to understand the nature of our perceptions. So that's where we talk about greater insight allows for a greater view, in the sense that what we call the Vibhashika, Suchantika, and so on, up through the Mahayana, the Yogacarya, and the Madhyamika, there's increasing greater understanding of the nature of our perceptions. This gives us a higher view, a greater insight into what we then refer to as emptiness. So there's some very interesting ways in which we can understand this. Anybody who attended the teachings on Madhyamika might remember the famous cowherd that as far as the Prasangika Madhyamikas go, then they don't actually analyze the world. And Rinpoche would often quote the Sutra of Meeting of Father and Child, where in which the Buddha says, as far as ordinary perceptions go, I completely agree with the world. And that's what we have then, what is known as the cowherd's view, or what sometimes is known as what is known to the world. And in Tibetan is Jitin Jakta Chepa, what is acting upon what is simply accepted by the world. And that's just not, that's when there's no analysis. And that's, you could say that's just, things as they are, how we ordinarily just see them. And this is something that we then have in the consequence school, which is when we're not conceptualizing anything, but it could also mean that we don't actually have any insight with regards to reality. So of course, from the sage that doesn't have any viewpoint or any particular conceptual constructs about reality, that simply just settles in reality, without any confusion. If somebody comes along and says, gosh, I love, chocolate, and then you just go, yeah, okay. And if somebody else says, I hate chocolate, you just say, okay, and whatever the world says, It's not that they're completely uncritical, but it just means that they basically don't subject the world to further analysis. Now, this is, however, what we do in general when we're approaching the understanding of emptiness, because that is where some degree of analysis is needed. We'll look at that, and eventually, of course, you could say that is also basic to the view of the Prasangika, the consequent school. But to get there, we initially begin with some degree of questioning, analyzing. And something Toltec often would say is, as soon as you begin to question anything, you're heading in the direction of absolute truth. The more you question, if you keep questioning, eventually you'll find that nothing withstands this, what we could call absolute analysis. But anyway, when we have just slight analysis, and that's in fact what we have in, for example, in the standard model of physics, where we understand that there are certain entities, particles, and there's also dimensions of time and so forth, where in the Suchantika viewpoint, this is then, you could say, the second tenet. We have the Vibhashika that understands how phenomena, they exist in terms of partless particles and also partless moments of time. And then we have the Suchantika who say that phenomena in the relative truth, they exist as the labels that we give them. But when we analyze, we go down into what we then call the particular, the functional particulars. So we could say that we perceive things, sure, but that's our particular version of things. And that's relative truth. And that's where the sage goes beyond just appearances and begins to come down to a level of phenomena in which you could say the actual functioning thing effectively is there. And that's what is then known as absolute truth in the context of the Suchantika. So there's still something, you could say, some substance that are the basis there, some external physical reality. So that's where we have then slight analysis, some degree of looking into reality. Then you have deep analysis, which is then Yogacarya, or the mind-only school, which sees that even though we go down to particles, they in turn also are constructed. They in terms also have parts. And that's where we go all the way down and see, in fact, what we are experiencing is in fact created by our mind. And that's where we then understand that in the higher, the view is then understanding that appearances, what is generated in our mind in terms of the object is entirely the mind. So that's where we then have deep analysis. So we go through this ascending scale of analysis: no analysis, slight analysis, and deep analysis. So Douglas Duckworth says, it is important that Mipham depicts all three of these levels of analysis as functioning in terms of conventional, not ultimate reality. Thus, he can incorporate a mind-only presentation of conventional reality, that is, the nature of appearance is mind, within a middle way view of the ultimate, that is, the nature of appearances is emptiness. This is key to the way he integrates the two philosophies of mind only and the middle way into the yogic practice school of the middle way. And this is very much the vision of the great Shantarakshita, who Mipham Rinpoche would sometimes refer to as the third great chariot. The first chariot being Nagarjuna, the second being Asanga, and then Shantarakshita, who brought these two together, where essentially the mind-only school of Asanga and the middle way school of Nagarjuna, they were seen as actually working beautifully together. One speaks about the relative conventional experience that we have. The other expounds how reality actually exists as it is. So this is very important in terms of us seeing the unity of these. And that's the beauty of Mipham Rinpoche's seeing the complementarity of these two traditions. So now, with regards to the mind-only school, then we have some classifications here that might be helpful for us, and it certainly sort of shows us a little bit about how we can relate to our perceptions. There is the conventional mode of appearance. This is just how we see things. Tanya Nangsul. Then you have conventional modes of reality. Tanya Netsul. That's again how things exist, and that's again where we would say, well, relatively then, the absolute, this is just appearance of this. These are in reality, this is the mind. But of course, conventionally, yes, phenomena just appear as external objects. You know, that's everything that we perceive operates on a very, you can say, ordinary level of just external appearances. But if we begin to analyze, and that's where we go beyond just appearances and we go into how things actually are. The Tibetan word is netsul, which means how things abide. The other word is nangsul, that's how things appear. So how things abide is then translated as reality, but still within the conventional mode. So that's where we would say conventional mode of reality. We would say this cup that we share perception of as is then, in fact, this generation of the image is created within our mind. But we're not denying that it actually does have a conventional mode of appearance as something external. So mind only accepts that an appearance like a book is perceived as external. They refute that this conventional perception of a book has a reality outside of our mind. That is where anything that we perceive, if we analyze, then the appearance aspect is entirely generated by the mind, and there's nothing outside of that. Now, it doesn't mean that the tree and the empty forest and all of that, we're not denying that they're not external objects or external phenomena, but our way of generating image is by the mind. So this does not refute the conventional reality of the appearing object as an external object. It refutes the idea that the perceived is external, meaning my idea of cup and your idea of cup. That is actually out there and something that's real. And this, ladies and gentlemen, this is where the middle way school is rather helpful for us in the modern world who live within a discourse that holds that phenomena exist as external and real. And in fact, what we have nowadays is the idea that there's nothing beyond that, that there actually is no mind. And even the mind is created by matter and external phenomena. The idea of consciousness is just a sort of a misunderstanding or a sort of lack of understanding of what in fact are just neurons firing and so forth. So in that way, the mind-only school is very helpful for us really to go beyond some of the, you could say, more confused presumptions of modern day view on reality. But it's important that we understand that we say appearances are mind, and we also understand when there's an object out there. Now, the appearing object, the foundations for it out there, we're not saying that is mind. So the one thing is to have an appearance, the cup, but the object, we're not saying that is mind too. Like Douglas Duckworth was saying, otherwise that's mind, then that would have a mind of its own, so to speak. So there is an object, but the way that we construct it, that is the mind. So he says, the system of mind only offers a richly complex and powerful explanation of the world. The dominant role of the mind in constructing the world is a fundamental feature of the view of Tantra too. That's right, isn't it? Because that's where we juxtapose ordinary confused perception with the perception of reality that's not tied up with confusion. And that's where we talk about pure perception. So what we have in terms of our experience continually comes back to the mind. And that's where the mind can be caught up in a version of the world that's fueled by confusion. That's what we call impure perception. Or we can understand the world as it's created by the mind. That's not where it's not filtered by confusion. That's where we talk about pure perception. And this, of course, is what becomes the view of what we can call conventional truth within the Vajrayana. Then he goes on to say, like all prominent exegetes of philosophical systems in Tibet, however, Mipham rejects the mind-only position and identifies with the middle way. And we'll see what it is that he rejects about the middle way, because we know he's okay with the conventional, but he's a little bit, there's something else that bothers him about what bothered the sort of philosophers in Tibet, or the lamas or masters in Tibet, about the mind-only position. According to Mipham, the problem with mind only as a philosophical school is that it hangs on to a view that the basis of appearances, again our mind, the basis of that is the non-dual, self-illuminating and self-aware mind. That mind, but we also sometimes, when we talk about the three natures, is what we call the dependent nature, that is ultimately real. And this is where, remember, in those who attended Madhyamika teaching, there's a lot of refutation of the Yogacarya because of that, because of hanging on to this dependent nature, or as the ultimate nature of mind, the self-aware, luminous mind. So in the middle way, however, nothing is held to be ultimately real. So that's where we have this radical sort of underpinning of everything that essentially is why we hold the middle way as being the ultimate view, freedom from any reference points whatsoever. So then we have this perception and reflexive awareness, what we perceive, and then the perceiver, and the perceiver being reflexive in the sense that awareness knows itself. Right now, if I say clock, you know that you heard the word clock. So there's an awareness of what's happening in the mind. There's a self-aware quality of knowing that we know, and that's what we call reflexive awareness. So in general, the middle way does not analyze perceptions, which are, like we looked at before, the cowherd's view, what is renowned for the world, or simply one's own appearance. So that's where the middle way, like Tongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, they're a little bit the hippies, because they just say, oh yeah, well, there's it's all just dependent arising, empty nature, and as such, there's the only thing the Prasangika, or the middle way, generally sort of not the Prasangika, but middle way overall. They would really not, the Madhyamaka overall don't go into analysis of the conventional. They just say, oh, it's all just appearances. Or they would even say it's one's personal appearance or one's personal experience. Now, mind only, and again, this is where they're very helpful for us in the modern world who operate very much with analysis and with explanations. They would say the perceived images, not the external objects, what we see, cup, right? Not the objects in and of itself, but that the images, they're generated through two aspects. An objective aspect, which is known as the sungnam, which is what we perceive as the object, and the subjective aspect, the zinam, which is the sense of being a perceived subject, perceiving subject. Now, this is where you sometimes, those of you who read a little bit of Tibetan would say you're familiar with the term sungzin, which essentially is duality. It's the perceiver and perceived, or grasper and grasped. But that takes place, as much as we think in that duality, there's something out there. In fact, it is just a single cognitive event. That is where we can go back to what we could call an ontological primitive, which is just, well, we can extrapolate, we can assume that there is an external object, but as far as we coming right back to what we can verify empirically in terms of our experience, well, there's really just one single cognitive experience, and that is the mind that is generating a consciousness cup or whatever it might be. So experience is known as a conscious event, and it does not necessarily, as we often think or generally think, imply an external world. Knowing that we know is reflexive awareness or self-aware awareness. So this is where there is this quality that just knows very simply. There's merely a cognitive condition of knowing. So Mipham makes a point that this is renowned for the world. We know that we know. That's why his point is, this is not something that's particularly absolute. It's something that just operates, and it's very real for us. So anything that we undertake in terms of ascertaining or understanding the world, what we looked at last time, remember there was various valid cognitions. There's valid cognition of confined perceptions, and then there was a valid cognition of pure perception, where the valid cognition of pure perception is the valid cognition that sublime beings have when there's no obscurations. But as far as our ordinary dualistic experience goes, then we do have this valid cognition of confined perception, which is basically the way that we just simply understand the world. And that is based on this reflexive awareness, this quality of intelligence that knows. So reflexive awareness is essential to our ability to function rationally. However, this is again this thing, the mind only asserts this reflexive awareness as absolute. Mind, middle way refutes its ultimate status along with everything else. So this is sort of overall for the way that the mind only school treats perceiver and perceived. Yeah. So sorry, perceiver and reflexive awareness. Now we're going to look at the traditions of mind only, and you will come across these terms here and there. Let me just see if there's any questions at this point. Ooh. Okay, let's just do that. There's a question now. Question: I thought mind only denies the conventional existence of all external objects and entities, and that the apparent external world is just the arising of common karma of sentient beings, and that there is conventionally nothing external at all. Well, look, this is what we're actually going to look at now. And so there is a general, as we come across here, there's a general ascertainment that the mind only school, it essentially would say that there is it's mind that, yes, you're right, the mind that creates everything, and yet at the same time we wouldn't attribute mind to the external phenomena. So as such, you're right. But I think you've said that there are external conventional objects. A tree falls in the forest. Yes, that's where, like Longchenpa was saying, we would say we're not actually the Longchenpa says we refute the inherent existence of the perception, but we're not refuting the existence of the object of perception as such. So that's where but yes, the tree falls in the forest. Isn't this the same thing as representationalism in the Western tradition, which is the view of neuroscientists, etc.? Well, there is some overlap with neuroscience in the sense of perceptions being generated and being represented in the brain. But I'd be a little bit wary of entering into that discussion exactly. But it is interesting that there's a common feature there that objects, as we think of them as external, are in fact generated within the subjective. Of course, in the Buddhist context, we say in the mind. In the neuroscientific context, we would say in the brain. What is the significance of pointing out that a moment of cognition is a single cognitive event rather than the subject-object? Is it one way of negating the conventional boundary of selfhood? It is, because the self is constructed in relation to object. And as long as we operate with this notion, there's an object, then we also have attraction and aversion and reaction in general that generates the dynamic between subject and object. And that's where the meditator, the sage that settles into you could say, non-dual cognition of phenomena doesn't posit the phenomena as other. And that's why and not from the point of view as some special technique, but from the point of view that ontologically, the subject and object are non-existent. They are conceptual constructs. And what comes down to, you could say, an immediate recognizable fact is that we actually just had a cognitive event, a single cognitive event. But let's see, because the thing about the external appearing objects and so forth, yes, we would generally say that mind only says that it's just the shared perception of sentient beings that generates perceptions. So yes, okay. Or rather that what appears as external is in fact just generated by the image that we're generating by the mind. Is entirely generated by the mind only, and we're not holding that there is an external object as such. But then again, there's some discussions around the subtlety of this point, and so we have two kinds of mind only here. We have then what we call the Semsam Namden and the Semsam Namzun. So the first is the proponents of real images, the Namden, and they hold appearances to be truly real. We'll see what that implies. The proponents of false images, Nam Zunpa, hold appearances to be mere illusions. So that's where we have the ones that would say there is a perception, and for as far as these perceptions go, this is what we also have in the Abhidhamma, for every perception, there is a corresponding consciousness. So this is half eggist. I'm not entirely sure where that term comes from. Anyway, equal number of perceived and perceiver, where there's as many moments of consciousness as there are aspects. And then there's a non-dual diversity. Everything again comes back to this single cognitive moment. So to explain a little bit sort of more, then we would say the half-eggists, they claim that every individual aspect of an object of perception is seen by corresponding consciousness in rapid succession. So for example, you're watching a movie, and at the same time you're hearing the sound. and you think it's coming together. But they would say it's a moment of very quick, rapid, you could say, shift back and forth between the senses in terms of hearing and seeing and so on. So then the second group, equal number of perceived and perceive, operate with a complex perceptual symmetry where there's just as many facets of subjective consciousness as there are facets to the perceived objects. So again, it sounds very complex, but anyway, that's one view. And then the last group, non-dual diversity, operate with a perceptual non-dualism, where there is just one subjective aspect of cognition that perceives a myriad of objective qualities that are not different from it, i.e., a singular consciousness sees all the manifold aspects at once. So Mipham, and I would say the first one belongs more to the Abhidharma. That's where we actually are going back and forth between the different conscious modalities very quickly. The second one, which is then the perceptual symmetry, Mipham says that's the most practical account for how things appear. So that's where they are, you could say, consciousnesses that correspond to all the various perceptions in a single moment. And then you have, when accounting for reflexive, so that's particularly for how things appear. When accounting for reflexive awareness, then perceptual non-dualism, the last one, is more practical. So then you have the other one, the false image school. And this seems to align itself more with the middle way school. And it's where they would say it's not really that much of a mind-only school view, because it's really just referring to everything as just being false images. It's much closer to the middle way view. But as far as so that's where it's an excellent understanding, but it's just not mind-only. So Douglas Duckworth, he comments, in contrast to those who view the perceptual content of images as real, the second division of mind only, the proponents of false images, circumvent a rational account of perception because they do not ascribe any real status to appearances other than stating that appearances are illusions. According to their system, all perceived appearances, none other than the unreal projections of a deluded mind. Mipham suggests that this system, by definition, is not really mind only, because the unreal images are held to be separate from the real mind. And thus, this is a bit later, thus even though the proponents of false images are closer to the middle way in that they deny the reality of external objects, the position of the proponents of real images and that of complex perceptual symmetry in particular, the second category, is better suited for an analysis of conventional reality, the way things appear. So that's where, if we're looking at an explanation of how things appear, then the second category is more useful. The one from those that hold images as real, the second category, that explains better conventional reality. And the proponents of false images, that's more along the lines of the middle way. So this is the two schools of the mind only. So the middle way. So that's where we would say that whatever there is beside the middle way, they would still, and this is what we saw in this ascending, the ascent of the views, the ascending analysis, that they still come back to something, even to mind, and that's still viewed as something that is substantial. So that's why we would say, relative to the middle way, the lower tenets, they are what we call substantialists in varying degrees, But significant, and this is, significant for the middle way, is that relative and ultimate truth do not necessarily constitute a hierarchy. And I think we saw this last time also. There's not a qualitative difference in and of themselves. Appearances are dependent arising. And in that they're dependent arising, well, for the middle way view, then that means they're empty. Anything that's dependent doesn't exist unconditionally or independently. So the dependent arising that constitutes relative truth, the appearances, is the emptiness of absolute truth. So that's how we generally, particularly like we saw last time, according to the second turning of the wheel, this is how we understand relative and absolute truth. Relative being the display of dependent arising phenomena, and emptiness, the emptiness of these phenomena being absolute truth. But then we saw last time also there's another way, according to the third turning of the wheel, which is more along the lines of experience, phenomenology or epistemology. That is more about the experience. And that's where we then speak about absolute truth as understanding this unity of appearance and emptiness. And relative truth is when we fail, and essentially we have a distorted view of reality. So we looked at just here we have the Great Exposition School, the Vibhashika or Jetakamara. Then we have the Sutra School, the Sutrantika or Dodepa. Then we have the mind only, Samsam or Chittamatra. And then we have Madhyamika, Umapa, the middle way. Now these four, they really are. This is all, as far as what you could say, these topics that we come across again and again in Indo-Tibetan Buddhism. These four presentations really, you could say, are the ones we return to again and again. So we talk about four tenets in general, and so they each have their own particular understanding of relative truth and ultimate truth. We could say relative truth is how things appear to us as they do, and the way that things are, beyond our confused projections about things. So in the Great Exposition Schools, they speak about how we experience things relatively. Well, there we have the distorted experience of a permanent self. And we also think in terms of a permanent object and so forth. And that's where we would say the irreducible elements, dharmas, such as the irreducible particles and the objective and the irreducible elements of time and the subjective experience. Then we have the Sutrantika or Sutra School, and that's where the distorted view is that we think of things as truly existing, what in fact just is our perception of these things. That doesn't actually touch what we then, in ultimate truth, can discern through wisdom and seeing that phenomena beyond our projections, they exist as functioning particulars. This is the view of the Sutrantika school, and it comes again with the first. The Vibhashika more is about the objective ontological understanding. The Sutrantika comes back to a more epistemic understanding in terms of the subjective, the way that we subjectively engage in perception. Then there's the mind-only school. That's where we have the distorted reality. That's where we speak about duality, subject and object, duality. Yeah, that's where we fail to see how phenomena in fact are our own projections. And the absolute truth is then this non-dual mind, the luminous non-dual mind, the simple knowing, and that mind is then held to be absolute. Now we come down to emptiness, so to the middle way, and that's where the absolute is just seen as emptiness. There's nothing that is seen to possess absolute substance or reality. But in there you have two ways of understanding relative truth, and there's the dependent arising, which we're looking at in general. When we understand the middle way, we generally talk about the dependent arising and emptiness as relative and ultimate truth. But it is important, particularly when we engage with Vajrayana and Tantra, that we also take into account, again, this epistemic, or you could say experiential aspect of relative truth is confusion. Absolute truth is when the subject is not confused. So one operates within the on the level of the objective, other on the subjective, one on the ontological and one more on the epistemic. So that's the middle way. So in that the middle way doesn't subscribe to anything as possessing ultimate reality, and simply refers to ultimate understanding as that which is entirely beyond conceptual constructs. You could say there's something very beautiful about the middle way, because it is really the place that we finally are free from any positions. And that, you could say, is the death knell, or the sort of final statement that puts to end philosophy, if you like. It puts the end the whole idea of constructing positions and the bias, etc. So it's something extremely beautiful, really. And of course, it's implicit in all the various levels of the Buddhist teaching, but it's, you could say, taken to the nth degree, really, thanks to Nagarjuna. So we would say all the various tenets, they agree that phenomena appear as they do until obscurations are purified. So we're all operating with this very, very simple reality that as long as we're dualistic individuals, then inevitably we operate with the sort of perception of everything as being as they do, ordinary, external, and so forth. So for the middle way, that phenomena are empty does not mean that they don't appear. This is so important. When we talk about emptiness, we're just talking about how phenomena are, in that they are dependently arisen. They don't exist in an unchanging way, and we'll look at that. What we mean with emptiness or lack of identity, and we have all these words. We say lack of true establishment. We say lack of inherent existence, lack of true, true inherent establishment, and so forth. All of these, this way of understanding emptiness or lack of identity. The curious thing is the fact that phenomena are, you can say, made up of causes and conditions. That's why everything can move. Everything is fluid, and it's essential for everything to function. So that emptiness is in fact necessary for everything to function. And it's also essential for us to understand everything. We can understand others because we can see their point of view. I mean, you could actually say the degree to which we are wise persons is the degree to which we can understand how others see things. You know, if we're wise people, we make good negotiators because we understand different points of view. That is actually the ability to go beyond just our own reference point and understand the position of others. So that's where for us actually to exist, we need that openness. And that's why Nagarjuna also says, for those for whom emptiness is possible, everything is possible. For those for whom emptiness is not possible, nothing is possible. So it's, you can say, indispensable, really. And so that's where we're not talking about some sort of difficult philosophy. We're just talking about the nature of things as they actually are. And that's where it doesn't take long before we can understand that phenomena are really just a web of causes and conditions. This we can understand. What's the issue here is to realize it. Because that's where we also understand our addiction or fixation on self is deluded, in that we are attributing solidity to what is in fact just a label, and a label for what is continually shifting. I hope everyone saw Tansikan's teaching the other day, the teaching on loneliness. And This is so skillful of Rinpoche because we're all lonely, right? And we sort of go to this thinking, oh, I'm lonely. I like something nice and warm and something sweet and something nice by the fireside. They can sort of deal with my loneliness. Rinpoche, what can you say that will alleviate my loneliness, right? And then we go in, and Rinpoche from the start simply refutes the existence of a self. So there we go, hardcore as anything, right for the jugular, that self is in fact an impossibility, because what we're attributing to it is in fact just a set of constructions, dependent arising. So self doesn't exist in any of the skandhas. It's not that the skandhas exist in the self, and so forth. What we call the essentially refutation of what we call the transitory collection. That what we have is a transitory collection that we label and solidify as a self. So that is where our delusion consists. So of course, from there, yes, that's also what helps us to then be softer and also have sympathy for others who don't have that. And of course, as the session went by, it became increasingly softer in terms of its, because the compassionate flavor of the discussion, but it really started off with what we could call absolute analysis, straight for the jugular. Anyway, so this is where this emptiness is really an essential insight. And just quoting Douglas a few times, he says, if something had an identity, it would never change, because if it did, it would thereby lose that identity and become something else, right? So we are ever changing, and phenomena are ever changing. In other words, this is an important point. If you want to have sort of something, a mantra or a slogan for this, then in other words, there are no real substances, only real processes. Well, let's see if those processes are real, but because conventionally they are. And he says, this is the reason why emptiness, the dependent nature of things, is a necessary condition for existence. In the philosophy of the middle way, all things are empty because nothing can exist without depending on something else. For Mipham, the main difference between mind only and the middle way boils down to the fact that in the system of mind only, the non-dual reflexive awareness is held to be inherently existent. In the middle way, nothing exists inherently or independently. Mipham argues that the dispute between mind only and the middle way does not concern whether external objects exist or not. Rather, the dispute concerns the status of consciousness, whether it is inherently existent or not. So that's simply where we would say that this reflexive awareness is such that it doesn't withstand absolute analysis. We could never find something substantial, enduring, permanent about it. And the fact that it functions means that it must be empty. Yeah. So then we have something very, very interesting and important. And this really was, you could say, an approach that signified the middle way school for the first 4 centuries, pretty much, in Tibetan Buddhism. And it's what we call, it's essentially Shantarakshita's approach, which is the yogic practice school of the middle way. And what we're going to see is that in Mipham Rinpoche's understanding of this, actually the two approaches of the middle way and the Yogacharya, the mind only, come together. And so the mind only here is referred to as the yogic practice, Yogacharya. And this becomes a particular way that the middle way engages with relative truth. So we have generally 2 middle way schools: the autonomy school, Tantrika, and the consequent school, Prasangika. So the autonomy school is something that originated by somebody called Bhaviveka. The consequent school is something that is associated with someone called Buddha Palita, and particularly Chandrakirti. Now, for those of you who are interested, and I know some of you are, I'm going to upload a brilliant piece. I think it's about 15 pages or so, written by Woolston Fletcher from the Padmakara translation group, and the one who, together with his partner Helena Blankletter, they translated both the introduction to the Middle Way with Mipham Rinpoche's commentary, and also the adornment of the Middle Way with Mipham Rinpoche's commentary. And it's absolutely brilliant, and it gives you the really the historical context for understanding these terms, and also, like we'll see later, some of the, you could say, debates that took place between what we call the later development of the Middle Way school, basically the Gelug tradition of Tsongkhapa, and the earlier traditions. And so we have these two ways of approaching the Middle Way, and the autonomy school really means that those who would say something, you say initially Nagarjuna, he taught the Middle Way in terms of pointing to how any conceptual construct ultimately fails to convey the nature of the absolute reality. And so the way he did that using language is essentially he exposed the flaw of any assertion with regards to absolute reality. And this, of course, was an important point. But later on, basically, you could say out of compassion, and you could say out of the need for communicating this truth, then in a different context, then Bhaviveka, he taught Nagarjuna's view, but using something that we, by the way, it's not Sven Tantrika, but it's Swatantrika. Sorry, typo. He taught this in terms of syllogisms and what we call autonomous statements, where he essentially made assertions that it would enable people to understand what is Nagarjuna talking about. What do they mean with what they're saying in the Middle Way school? Because if you just go hardcore, this is what the consequent school would do, upholding this sort of approach, just the hard reasoning, leaving no reference point, then the audience very often would just be sort of like stunned and sort of not really able to, make sense of it. And that's where Bhaviveka's approach and the Swatantrika approach is very compassionate and sort of relates to where the audience is at and speaks to their reality, and then eventually takes them, of course, to the understanding that the absolute nature cannot be grasped. So that's where the autonomy school and the Swatantrika, they're more interested really in the communicating and in essentially relating to the you could say explaining the two truths and so on. So that's the Swatantrika. And so we have the consequent school, which upholds this approach of Chandrakirti, and that actually came later, which is that this was translated in Tibet at a later stage, that very much upholds this Prasangika approach. And what we'll see here is that they're not ultimately different, but they're you could say methodologies are different. Now, when it comes to the Swatantrika, there's two subschools. One is what we call the Swatantrika, sorry about all the names here, and then Yogacarya Swatantrika. We're just going to be talking about the Yogacarya Swatantrika. So this is the one that we're talking about here. This is the yogic practice school of the Middle Way. So I think we can make the acronym YPMW. Anyway, unlike the consequent schools, the yogic practice school of the Middle Way distinguishes between relative and ultimate truth. They hold that things exist conventionally. They take into account that there are perceptions which we are, you could say, entangled with. And they operate with these perceptions and explaining these perceptions. And that's on the conventional level. And they also, with regards to the absolute, they explain the absolute using logic, you could say dismantling our assumptions, But they also hold that the uncategorized understanding of the absolute is beyond any reference point whatsoever. They're beyond anything that we can say. And that's where they agree with the Prasangika. So the Svatantrikas, they have this additional component of the ability to explain or point to the ultimate, what they call categorized ultimate, and they do that by refuting our conceptual positions, and they also accommodate how the uncategorized ultimate cannot be in any way, you could say, pointed to, but simply also arrived at through dismantling any positions. So as their view of the ultimate leads to realization of the categorized, they agree with the consequent school. This was very much Mipham Rinpoche's point, and this, of course, also was intrinsic to the middle way of the early Madhyamikas. So they explain conventional reality. They agree with the consequent school, the Prasangika, as far as absolute reality goes, but they explain the conventional reality with mind only. And that's what we call the Yogacarya Svatantrika. Just as an aside, the Sotrantika Svatantrika, they use the Sotrantika approach of generally characterized phenomena and particular phenomena. And again, they still assert you could say, an external reality. So what is special, where the yogic practice school of the middle way differs from the general mind only, is that they do not accept that this reflexive awareness is truly existent. So this is nature that is non-dual. They wouldn't say that is something that is truly existent. They refute that. So Douglas Duckworth says, it is important to keep in mind that, according to Mipham, the main distinction between the middle way and mind only is that followers of mind only hold on to a non-dual cognition as real. Other than that, there is no significant difference between mind only and the middle way in terms of the view, meditation, or conduct. Thus, the main dispute between the followers of mind only and the middle way does not concern the status of an external world, or whether or not a world exists apart from the mind. Rather, the main issue is the status of cognition. Whereas the mind-only school regards the mind as truly real, in the yogic practice school of the middle way, cognition is empty, just like everything else. Okay. This is being said a few times, but it's an important point. Yeah. Now, we're going to be touching on, in the last section, well, you know that since you've read the text, but we're going to be touching on refutation of the Gelug position. And that's why I would say it's very helpful to go and read Wilson and Helena's introduction to the adornment of the middle way that I'll upload in the resource folder. It's such interesting reading, actually. If this is interesting for you, you will really enjoy reading this because it clarifies really context. And of course, everybody has the greatest regard for Tsongkhapa, and we would also say that so much of the different views, and we talked about this before, they of course come out of, you could say, the need for particular emphasis. But nevertheless, there is a significant difference in some of the views of Tsongkhapa and the earlier Madhyamikans, and this is where the views of Tsongkhapa and the Gelug became very dominant. We've also touched on that, and Mipham Rinpoche, he refutes that. He refutes some of the positions of Tsongkhapa, and so this is where you could say he really legitimized or brought back a recognition of the value of the early Madhyamaka positions. And that's what we're talking about here. And that's where Tsongkhapa was very big on how the consequent school is much higher than the middle way, and particularly also particularly of the yogic practice school of the middle way. So for Mipham Rinpoche, like we just saw, the consequent school view is not higher than that of the yogic practice school of the middle way. The consequent school is a more direct way. It is for the more advanced yogis. So that's why it's a very, when we study Chandrakirti, it's a very high view and particularly operates with incredibly sharp reasoning. So for the very advanced, yes, very helpful. And what it points to is, and what dominates or what really signifies the consequent school is, here, quote, a discourse that emphasizes the uncategorized ultimate, free from assertions. So this school emphasizes this uncategorized ultimate. And the uncategorized ultimate is the genuine meaning of emptiness, whereas the categorized ultimate is just a conceptual approximation. So we understand that when it comes to ordinary perceptions and conventional reality, of course, nothing withstands ultimate analysis. The consequent schools overcomes the concepts of the true truths in the sense that for the consequent school, there's not any interest in making any assertion about how the conventional reality exists. Apart from they would just say, well, it's just like the cowherd. But they're not interested in developing any philosophy around it, and they would just come back to, any assertion of any kind is refuted. So they use reasons to expose the flaw with any assertions, enabling insight into the non-conceptual. And this is very important. So as much as we could say it's very advanced, it's also something that we might as well get used to, because ultimately it's very important that we're with the understanding of the nature of reality, the vipassana that's basic to the entire Buddhist path, and which is, you could say, taken to the depth and the genuine, profound reality of what it really signifies. This vipassana, this wisdom, is really, you could say, brought out through the prasangika methodology of essentially showing how any assertion won't work. So it is something to be it's very important to have that. And of course, that's also why everybody, Mipham Rinpoche, everybody along the line in Tibetan Buddhism or Indo-Tibetan Buddhism would assert the validity of the prasangika view. But there is also then this notion that it is for the very, you could say, the very brightest. So Douglas Duckworth said, since the nature of reality is empty, any expression of this inexpressible reality is bound to be mistaken. What is significant here is that the consequent school shows this with words, not silence. It is quite remarkable. The distinctive feature of the consequent school is thus not based simply on linguistic form, rather inspired by a non-conceptual view. It is a way of using language to point beyond concepts. Mipham likens the method of the consequent school to the manner of ascertaining the empty nature of reality in the great perfection. It thus represents a direct, sudden path to the empty nature of reality. And this is also where the very nature of the view, what we call the view in the great perfection, is not something conceptual. It's not something where we can understand it in terms of words or thoughts or in any way describe it. It is direct, unconfused experience. So that's where we could say the prasangika approach very much aligns with the great perfection approach. Now, when you could say set these two versus each other. The yogic practice school, I think he has understood in the Svatantrika context, versus the consequent school. The yogic practice school has the upper hand in terms of analyzing how things appear. You could say conventional perceptions. The consequent schools excels in presenting things how they are. You could say the absolute nature of things. Analysis, this is important, analysis paves the way, as in the approach of the great perfection. So that also means when we come to the prasangika, there necessarily has to be a whole foundation that understands analysis and has dismantled, you could say, our assumptions about reality. Particularly for us in the modern world, this means not just, you could say, the general Buddhist understanding, but also the assumptions that we've been brought up with in terms of solidifying and particularly understanding the whole world in terms of existing as something solid, physical, material, basically based on matter, an entire materialist view. So graduating beyond that, then also the analysis that we have in the Buddhist vehicles. Yes, then when we come to the consequent school, then that makes tremendous sense. And of course, that's where analysis paves the way, as in the approach of the great perfection. So even when we go to the great perfection teaching, we still have what's called the preliminaries in the great perfection, which are, again, you could say, dismantling our assumptions about reality. And that's conceptual. So that's where, prior to engaging in the main part of the great perfection teaching, chekche, or the actual cutting, then there is a whole preliminary that operates with the dismantling of our assumptions about the mind and the objects of the mind, but particularly about the mind. Yeah. Just the other day, I was talking with Larry Mermelstein, who's one of the close students of Chögyam Trungpa Rinpoche, and he told how Chögyam Trungpa he took Ramana Maharshi's famous question, "Who am I?" He said, "This is not a question; it is a statement." And this is actually very much, afterwards I thought, this actually aligns, or as I was reading this today, I was thinking, this exactly aligns with what we're talking about here, because we're not left with an answer. We're left with, you could say, this, also what Elizabeth Mattis Namgyal refers to as the open question. By the way, whoever is interested, we're doing something on Sunday morning, 6 a.m. 6 a.m. Australian time. If anybody wants to join in, you'll have to go through Elizabeth's, portal. But we'll be talking about these things. But same thing also, the open question, right? So that's where Ramana Maharshi's "Who am I?" That's actually very similar to what we're doing with the consequent school, where we're not asking a question, but we're really just having asked the question, then we just settle with that. As you could say, the open dimension of not looking for a reference point, not looking for an answer. So Dr. Duckworth says, to work with the approach of the consequent school, one need not, and perhaps never has to, give up analysis right from the start. Rather, the realization of the consequent school is the result of an analytical process that no longer needs to engage in analysis, even though analysis was necessary on the way. In any case, the compatibility of one, the systematic conventional analysis of the way things appear in the yogic practice school, and two, the ultimate analysis of the way things are in the consequent school, is a central part of Mipham Rinpoche's presentation of the middle way. So this is also why so often in the great perfection teaching we see to leave mind without fabrication. And this is very difficult if we haven't actually arrived. So to leave mind without fabrication is to no longer be questioning. So that's where at that point, then there's no longer any analysis taking place. And that's, of course, that's a very profound way of engaging, you could say, this the mind that's not deluded. So so there's a famous line then from some debates that took place. This was actually between Chandrakirti and then a follower of Asanga who was called Chandragomi. He was a layperson, and anyway, their debate lasted for 7 years, and it attracted like Douglas Duckworth was saying, it attracted a lot of attention, and songs were made apparently. And one of the songs had in it these two lines here where it says, "Alas, Nagarjuna's scriptures are medicine for some, but poison for others. The texts of Maitreya and Asanga are, for all beings, simply nectar." So that's where the view of the consequent school, yes, it's extremely potent medicine, but presuming that we get it. Otherwise, we could fall into nihilism. Whereas when we're talking about the texts of Maitreya and Asanga, Buddha nature, the basic goodness, it's almost like we can't go wrong with that. Even though we might not arrive at, you could say, the ultimate view of freedom from conceptual constructs, even though we might get stuck in eternalism, that's better than falling into nihilism. The old siddhas of India, they also had a saying: those who believe in something are very naive. Those who believe in nothing are even worse. Anyway, Dr. Duckworth says here, an important message can be drawn from these lyrics. It points to the fact that it is easy to misunderstand the meaning of emptiness in the middle way. And when it is misunderstood, the ultimate truth of emptiness tends to become a nihilistic position, the poison. The yogic practice school, on the other hand, does not share the danger of being misunderstood as nihilism. Rather, it tends to be misunderstood as an extreme of essentialism, a view that the mind is truly real. In this, we may find a clue to why the yogic practice school is acclaimed to be nectar for all. Even if it is misunderstood, the extreme of essentialism is better than the nihilistic extreme, because an essentialist view, even a non-Buddhist belief in an eternal creator God, preserves an ethical grounding and thereby tends towards virtuous practices. Okay. I think everybody gets that. And also we could apply some social sort of analysis, and we could look at societies in which there is, you could say, a commitment to a greater God or a sacred principle, and the societies in which that is absent. I note at various times the consequent school is said to be for more advanced yogis. Then in other schools of the book, it is explained as more oriented to the preliminary pandita stage of a practitioner before they go off to the cave to be a yogi, at which stage the yogic practice school is more applicable. There seems to be a contradiction here. Can you clarify? Sure. Look, we would say that this is where we talked about, like last time, I think we talked about Rangtong and Shentong. And that's where we would say the Rangtong view, that essentially is what's highlighted by the consequent school. It's very important when we establish the view. But then when we go to practice, then it's more helpful to stick with the Shentong view. So that's where we could align the Shentong view a little bit with the yogic practice school. Yeah. So one is when we establish the view, the other is when we practice it. So yes, we could emphasize the prasangika when establishing the view, and the svatantrika more when we're practicing. Since Tibetan culture's resource of mind only is limited, is it possible that some traditions of the mind only school deny the mind as truly real? Yes, there is, by the way, and I'll get back to that. Is it helpful for liberation to study theory of mind such as half-egists? By the way, it's hard to claim that I am a follower of half-egists. Following emptiness sounds much more cool. Well, the thing is that we would say, and also Western academics have been writing about this for quite some time, but Mipham also will make this point. There's really just some of the Yogacharyas who who had that view. It's essentially, and this is, I'm indebted to Woolston and Helen on this point. There's the Yogacharya or the Chittamatran that abide by scripture, and then there's the Yogacharya, the Chittamatara who abide by tenets. One is Kait Semsam, and the other is Drupte Semsam. So it's the Drumta Sensam, like commentators, like someone called Dharmapala, who actually insisted that that dependent nature has an absolute reality. Whereas in the mind-only scriptures, such as the Lankavatara Sutra and others, there's no reference to mind as having an absolute nature. So we could say a little bit the mind-only school becomes sort of a whipping boy, sort of a straw man for some of the, you say the Majamicans. They can exercise their prowess in refuting inherent existence. So there's a rather benevolent view at the end of the day, but of course, particularly from Mipham Rinpoche's position, there's a very benevolent view on the Yogacharya position. So this is, yes. Then we come turning on the Giluk, but I'd like to emphasize really this is not intended to inflame. We don't want any wars happening here, but just identifying that there was a certain hegemony that extended itself through the centuries that follow Tsongkhapa's teachings and particularly his activity, and so that's why it was necessary to really, you could say, refute and essentially question, challenge, and refute some of the positions of the consequent school as it's presented, as it's interpreted by Je Tsongkhapa. So that's where the way that the Tsongkhapa presented the consequent school, it rejects the validity of the yogic practice school of the middle way. And this obviously stood very much different from some of the earlier schools of Madhyamaka. So Mipham, that Mipham refuted, no, probably refuted. Refuted several of Je Tsongkhapa's widely accepted views. This was controversial. So it elicited some responses, but like we read earlier on, it also, actually these responses engaged some debates that ended in some good friendships. And so it's all good. And also we saw a little bit last time, I think I was quoting some of the banters between some of the sort of the ways in which intellectualism sort of stood in opposition to the experiential approach, as in the this is anecdote from Tsupo from the Kamapas monastery. Anyway, emphasizing, gosh, somebody please help this man with his English. Anyway, emphasizing his take on the consequent school, Je Tsongkhapa rejected the conventional existence of reflexive awareness and the alaya. See, everyone agrees that it doesn't have, you could say, ultimate existence, but he rejected even the conventional existence of these. And Jamgön, he pointed out that the consequent school doesn't necessarily take that position. The consequent school is more about, and that's where he said, Jamgön Mipham defined the consequent school as a reference to the uncategorized ultimate truth. And Je Tsongkhapa was more defining the consequent schools with reference to the lack of inherent existence of relative truth. So they sort of they interpreted the consequent school message in different ways. But the other one then accepts then that there is a conventional reality that is acceptable and in no way interferes with the view of the uncategorized ultimate truth of the consequent school. So this, of course, also is something that was rather infuriating for followers of Tsongkhapa, because in several cases, Mipham identified Tsongkhapa as, against apologize for the typing, as holding autonomist, or what we call svatantrika, or even other emptiness views, the Shintong. And he did so because Mipham argued that establishing the ultimate truth as absence of true existence is necessarily a distorted conceptual position. And that's where Tsongkhapa, he very much would emphasize that even Buddha nature should be understood as simply not as as having any ontological role whatsoever, but rather that what we understand with absolute truth is simply just a non-affirmative negation, the absence of true existence. And Mipham would say, well, this sort of non-affirmative negation is necessarily just an image of the conceptual mind, just saying that things are not in a particular way. That works fine if we're operating within the Svatantrika view that uses the categorized emptiness. And that's where in the categorized emptiness, we could say, yes, things don't have an inherent existence. But to stick with that negation as constituting the absolute view, that Mipham would say that's not what the Prasangika school is about. And so he was saying ultimately, then it seems that Tsongkhapa seems to be a Svatantrika, and that didn't go down so well. So that's where the Gelug, they negate the ultimate existence of phenomena, not their conventional existence. We have this saying, quoting Tsongkhapa, where it says, "Bumba mitong tendu." So we would say the vase is not empty of vase; it's empty of inherent existence, and that's why they would say, well, if you say that the vase is not empty of vase, but only of its inherent existence, then you're essentially positioning one that there's the vase, and then there's a different emptiness that's apart from it. And again, this is something that this kind of division is fair enough when we're, as beginners, we're establishing the view of emptiness. But again, this doesn't constitute, again, the consequentialist view, the Prasangika view. So again, please read Woolston's introduction. That'll give sort of more, you could say, context of this whole, you could say, this debate. So Douglas says, Mipham also pinned other emptiness on Gelug view by portraying the stereotypically Gelug claim that phenomena are not empty of themselves, but are empty of inherent existence. That's what I was referring to, as a statement of other emptiness, right? Because something is still left, right? And that's the same as the Jonan tradition, they would say. He argued that leaving phenomena as they are, while negating something else that is other, that is inherent existence, is an other emptiness view. By arguing that the Gelug's own tradition asserts the view of the autonomy school and other emptiness, the very positions its followers so often vehemently put down, he turned the tradition on itself. Now, I would say he did so very politely and generally very confrontational. Some of the earlier commentators, they would get quite tough on Tsongkhapa, but Mipham sort of did all this with a very sort of polite, friendly, but at the same time also being quite sort of, you could say, strict with, or you could say quite, sticking with strict logic. So in this way also then the debates unfolded really, you could say, in a very proper way. So we have, if you look at the Padmakara translation of the wisdom chapter, it's called the wisdom chapter, and it's Mipham Rinpoche's commentary on the 9th chapter of the Bodhicharya Avatara. And in there, the Padmakara translation group has included some of the debates that were that were between some of the Gelug masters and and Jamgön Mipham. Okay. So somebody's going to be what's it called, dubbing on me. Oh dear. No, actually, the funny thing is actually Lama Zopa is actually, he has a Nyingma background, so he's very comfortable with the Nyingma view. Okay, all right. Thank you so much. And for next time, please read chapter 7, Emptiness and the Non-Conceptual. By this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death from this ocean of samsara may I liberate beings. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. For all my lives may I remain at your lotus feet and study, reflect, and meditate on your texts again and again. Sorry. Grant your blessings that I will hold, protect, and spread your teachings to the limits of space for as long as samsara lasts. All right. Thank you very much. See you next time.